Hey, hello everyone, and welcome back. I'd love to announce our next speaker now. Uh, Next, we're going to dive into the central role that electricity market design plays in the transition to clean energy in the face of climate change. Our second speaker, Professor Meredith Fowlie, investigates real-world application of market-based environmental regulations, the economics of energy efficiency, the demand side of energy markets, and energy use in emerging economies. She will discuss how electricity rate design affects when households use power, how quickly electrification advances, and who ultimately pays the costs of climate adaptation in the power sector. Meredith Fowlie is a professor in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department, faculty co-director at the Energy Institute at Haas, an affiliated faculty of the Energy and Resources Group, and co-director of the Energy and Environmental Economics Group at the National Bureau of Economics Research. Professor Fowlie has worked extensively on the economics of energy markets and the environment, providing frequent advice to policymakers, and her work has appeared in prestigious academic journals, including the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Review of Economics and Statistics. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Meredith Fowlie.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. And thanks to the organizers. I really like the idea of this lecture series, and it's a true honor to be asked to be part of it. Professor Tao is a really tough act to follow. I don't have fancy glasses. I don't have movies, but I am going to be trying to get you to think like an economist, even if only for 30 minutes of your life. So the organizers have asked us a little bit to talk about how we got here. And sorry, this is not working. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm going to keep talking and maybe, yeah, it's not working, so I'll keep talking. So I will say one thing before I get started. One of the reasons I was really excited to have this opportunity is it gives me the chance to communicate with a bunch of smart undergraduates who maybe haven't found their problem that they want to spend their life working on. The problem I want to spend my life working on needs all hands on deck. We need lots of creative problem solvers. So part of what I want to try to do today is encourage undergrads here at Berkeley. You are so fortunate to be here at Berkeley. Whatever you realize you're really excited about, there is a community of scholars here to be part of. So hoping after today, if what I'm talking about piques your interest, you'll come over to our great community of scholars here on campus with undergraduate classes and research projects and all sorts of exciting opportunities to get involved in. But how I got here, if you had asked me when I was an undergraduate, what's like the top 10, 20 subjects I might be interested in studying, economics was like not even on my top 100. My high school economics class was just not that inspiring. And so when I came to college, I thought I wanted to be an environmental scientist. And the reason was I grew up in Toronto, and I was fortunate to spend parts of my summers up north of Toronto in the forests and lakes. This is the beautiful Temagami Wilderness. And I was growing up in the 1980s and 1990s. And during that time, this part of the continent was being significantly impacted by acid rain and acid snow if you're in Canada. If you look at that map, that red looks bad, and you're right. But what was really striking is you would be walking through or canoeing through these parts of the forest, and they would look like this. They were just being eviscerated by this problem. And so I wanted to go to college to understand the problem and be part of the solution. So I was fortunate to go to Cornell. I went and started as an environmental scientist, but quickly realized that you didn't even need an undergraduate degree in environmental science to understand this problem. Decades and decades of industrial growth and economic activity, combined with not very stringent environmental regulations, meant that coal plants to the earth in the form of sulfuric acid and nitric acid. So it turns out if you dose trees and lakes for decades with that kind of treatment, they don't fare very well. So there's always more you can learn, certainly, in terms of the science of a problem, but it was pretty clear the problem we understood. And so then I somewhat naively thought, well, maybe we just don't have the solution to the problem. We understand the science, but we don't have the technology to make what we need, electricity and metal, but not make what we don't want, which is the air pollution. But there again, it turned out there was like 1940s era technologies, scrubbers, that we can install in industrial facilities and scrub out the emissions. You can see where I'm going. This like eureka moment when I realized I was an economist. So the problem was that if you're a coal plant or a nickel smelter, it's going to cost you millions and millions of dollars to install this equipment. You can pollute for free. So there was just no incentive to adopt the technologies that existed to mitigate the problem. So then my senior year, I found this class by Dwayne Chapman on environmental economics that blew my mind. And we talked about environmental problems. And he convinced me that so many of the environmental problems I was worried about were at their core economic problems. And he also talked about solutions. And many of you are probably too young to even remember the acid rain program. But in the 1990s, there was an amendment to the Clean Air Act here in the US. And it was scientists working with policymakers, working with lawyers, working with economists, to recover. A corresponding number of permits were allocated to these firms. All of a sudden, that coal plant had to pay to pollute. All of a sudden, that coal plant had an incentive to install this equipment that had been around for years. And moreover, these firms had an incentive to innovate and find better ways to reduce their pollution. So this is a pretty good news story. Like the problem, you don't hear about it because the problem, it's not eliminated, but it's been greatly mitigated. It costs less than we thought to reduce the problem because we had these incentives internalizing those costs. So I'm telling you that story for a couple of reasons. One, we're going to talk about some depressing, less tractable, or more pernicious problems. And I do think we have found solutions to a number of the environmental problems we've been struggling with. Two, it highlights like two key observations that get economists really, or environmental economists really excited. One is that at the core of many of our environmental problems is a market failure. And two, if we can identify the market failure and correct it, you can really unlock a lot of the technologies and behavioral changes we already know we need to deploy. We just can't figure out how to get them out there in the world. So the first few years of my career, I did spend thinking about local and regional pollution, but for the past 15 years, I've been working on climate change. Similar idea. We understand the science of climate change. There's a lot more we could learn, but I think it's pretty convincing, the data and the evidence that greenhouse gas emissions are increasing temperatures and changing the climate. I've been focused on the energy sector for a number of reasons, but I just see it as a linchpin of our climate change mitigation strategy. Currently, over 3/4 of the global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from the energy sector. And moreover, I think, and I'll be curious if other people have different ideas, but I think the most promising path to making massive reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions is decarbonizing the grid. So taking out the natural gas and coal and the remaining oil, replacing it with zero carbon energy sources. That takes care of the electricity sector. And then electrifying as much as we can, from the car in your garage to the furnace in your basement to industrial applications. So that's going to take a major change in the power sector and in the energy sector. We have the technologies we need. We can always invent better ones, but we've got what we need in terms of the wind and the solar and the batteries and the heat pumps and the industrial decarbonization innovations. This crazy graph, I love it. It was actually my screensaver for years, is giving you a sense of, this is the US energy system. This thing here, this bar here is all the energy inputs, the petroleum, the natural gas, the zero carbon sources, the coal. So you can see that what we need to do is dramatically, so renewable energy and nuclear together are a little bit like 17% of the energy inputs. So we need to get from 17% to a lot more. This little box is where I spend most of my time. This is the electricity box. This is these energy sources going into electricity and back out to meet our energy needs, from transportation to like cooling and heating our buildings to industry. So what we're talking about doing is driving up the size of these boxes and really increasing the role that electricity plays in powering our lives. So we have the technologies, but what we got to do is convince billions of people and millions of firms to make different decisions, to adopt the technologies that we have to change the behaviors in ways that'll help us achieve our goal. And that's where I think that we need the science, we need the law, we need the, it is an all hands on deck enterprise, but I really think that we need to use the prices and economic incentives that we actually can influence through policy to incentivize individual decisions to align with the decarbonization objectives we're trying to lay out for ourselves. So what I wanted to do today is talk about sort of three acts, three different research projects that we've been working on here at Berkeley. One that has to do with how electricity prices vary over time and how that can be used to shift behavior and reduce the cost of renewable energy integration. One that thinks about why we should worry when electricity prices are too high, and that's a California-based and talk a little bit about some solutions. So before we go there, I should mention that I do, when we think about prices coordinating behaviors to get us on track to a more sustainable, decarbonized economy, we often think about carbon prices. I do a lot of work on carbon pricing, but felt for this audience to hit closer to home with electricity prices. We're more likely to have electricity consumers in this room than carbon market traders. Happy to answer questions about carbon markets, but today I want to talk about electricity. I'm going to talk a lot in terms of kilowatt hours and megawatt hours, but you, like me, probably think more in terms of like laptop hours and refrigerator hours. So a kilowatt hour is about 20 hours. If your laptop is 50 watts, it's about 4 hours of a standard refrigerator. I also want to give you like a 1 minute primer on how electricity markets work, because they're pretty amazing. So if you think about right now, all the electricity we're consuming in this room and across campus and across California, even though battery costs have come down, it's still the case that the vast majority of electricity we're consuming right now is being produced right now. And electricity markets, therefore, have a pretty important role to play in both making sure the lights stay on, literally, right? That the supply meets demand, but also that we're meeting demand at least cost. So this is a cartoon version of something that's happening every second of every day in California and in other states and around the world. Electricity markets are forecasting demand and then asking all the suppliers in the market, especially in market-based systems like we have in this country, to sort of submit their bids, the price they need to turn on. So the width of these little cartoon boxes are sort of the amount of electricity these different sources can produce. And the height of these steps are how much it costs to produce electricity with those sources. This isn't the cost of investing in these sources. This is the cost of running these sources to generate more electricity. So in a cartoon way, you're organizing your suppliers in order from least to highest cost. And then the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve determines the electricity price. And the reason I wanted to talk you through that is you can imagine that over the hours of the day, demand is rising and falling. So the price is going to be moving around. And as we push more and more renewables into the system, the sun rises and the supply curve shifts out. The sun sets, the supply curve contracts in. So we're getting a lot of price variation over the day. So this is a picture of California electricity prices, wholesale prices on Wednesday. And what you'll see is like in the nighttime when there's no solar, it's like $20, $30 per megawatt hour. Then the sun rises and we actually get into negative price territory for reasons I can talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. And then the sun sets and we start seeing a positive price again. So these prices are moving around to hour, day to day over the seasons of the year. Your electricity price, at least until very recently, doesn't move. So what this picture is showing you is it's a somewhat older data, but the red is your electricity demand going up and down. We get up in the morning, we go to sleep. This blue line here is that wholesale price that I was talking about, the supply and demand intersection. So when demand is high, the price goes up. On a hot July day, when demand is really high, we're hitting capacity constraints, the price goes way up. But consumers just see the same price, hour after hour, day after day. And economists look at this and say, this is a market failure. The market is failing to signal to consumers, electricity is expensive right now, back off if you can, or if the price is too high. Electricity is cheap right now, you can consume more. And historically, this has been sort of necessary because it was very hard to communicate with you when electricity prices were high and low. And so it was prohibitively costly to be like calling you on the phone every hour to tell you what the electricity price is. But now with smart devices and the kind of technologies we have, it's very easy to communicate to people how prices are varying across time. So a question we had, and this is a few years ago now, was if we vary the price, if we send you a signal that says it's really expensive to consume today, will you change your behavior? Will you postpone your laundry? Because if you won't, if like human behavior is just not going to respond, then it's not worth investing a lot of time in this particular market failure. So what we did is we worked with a utility in Sacramento, and the basic proposal was as follows. You know, these are quite quaint prices. This was a few years ago. You're paying 10 cents per kilowatt hour every hour of the day. Would you be willing to spend 9 cents most hours? But in the hours of the year when we're really hitting a capacity constraint, we'll charge you a much, much higher price. The utility was interested in doing this because can you imagine, like, if there's no demand response, right? If when the price is high, no one's responding, we were having to build power plants that ran 1 or 2 hours a year because we need to keep the lights on. And there's no way to tell you that it's really expensive. So we're investing in a lot of capacity that we were just not using except in peak hours. So there's all sorts of reasons to want to try and send that signal to consumers to use our grid more effectively. Now, if you came home and saw this cute little door hanger on your door handle, you, if you're a typical Californian, would recycle it or ignore it. We knew that some people, like me, would get really excited, but we were worried that if we tried to recruit people into this kind of program, we wouldn't have much take up. So what we did was we played around with an observation that behavioral economists have documented, which is in choices that are either new or unfamiliar or like cognitively taxing, if there's a default option, a significant fraction of people will just go with the default. They'll kind of decide not to decide and land where you've nudged them. So I think Ted Miguel has addressed this audience, and he is like masterful in field experiments. We experimented on Californians. So we basically took a bunch of residential customers. We've got a large control group so we could sort of understand how people would behave if we hadn't been there to muck around with their electricity pricing. We assigned a bunch of customers to opt in, take up this program if you want to. And then we had an opt-out group that pushed people into the program and told them how to get out of it if they didn't want to be there. So if you're an opt-in, don't ask the economist why this image is the one we should be using to get people excited about time varying pricing. It was not our job. That's the opt-in pitch. That's the opt-out pitch. It's very similar. It's just we've flipped a switch between if you don't decide, you're in the program, or if you don't decide, you're out of the program. So the opt-in was actually surprising, but we were working with Sacramento Municipal Utility District that has a pretty good relationship with their customers. So 20% of the people actually opted into this program. Anyone want to guess how many people participated for the people we nudged in and had to actively opt out? 80, okay. It's missing. Okay. 95, I don't know where it went, but 95% of the people that we defaulted in stayed. So that was pretty remarkable. It was actually in line with some of the experiments people have done with like organ donation or healthcare plans when you nudge people in, you know, the vast majority. Your job is done. In this case, the people we nudged into the program, we needed them to respond, right? They're not going to give us any value to us if they're not actually responding to the price signals. So what we found was, what this is showing you is hours of the day relative to the control group. So what this is showing you, that top group is our eager opt-in people. And relative to the control group, in this critical peak time, they gave us over a 25% reduction in their electricity consumption. So that's a very significant reduction. When we look at the people who we nudged in, and this is like 70% of the population, they gave us a 10% reduction, which is something. My guess is some people weren't paying attention and others were. The utility was thrilled with this. This was very valuable to them. So they knew that if they could nudge people into the program, send them a high price signal, they could get a demand response. We did survey folks about this, and the people who'd been nudged in actually reported liking the program, or at least not hating it. And it seemed like this was a case where they just had too much to do. They were trying to get their kid to soccer practice. They had better things to do than jump into a program and find out about it. So we did this research, we documented, we talked about it. The utility was very excited about it. It meant they could build fewer power plants, postpone power plants, and integrate renewables more effectively. And a few years later, California, I'm not sure how many people know that they're on some sort of time of use pricing. Yeah, so California sort of moved towards a default design, where customers in California are defaulted into a time of use program where 4 to 9 p.m. every day when the sun some of the demand to hours of the day where it's more where it's cheaper to make demand with the solar. That, if you look at that blunt time of use where the price changes only once during the day, it's simple for customers to understand, but we could in principle do so much better in terms of signaling hour to hour variation. Plenty of people do not want that. They would rather not be focused on their electricity meter every day. We all have better things to do. But there is some experimentation with smart appliances and hourly pricing. So you could tell your laundry machine to do your laundry at the cheapest time of day. So this is an ongoing area of experimentation, which is becoming more important as we move from like 20 to 30% renewables penetration to pushing towards 70, 80, 90. It's going to be a lot cheaper to integrate a lot of intermittent resources if we have a demand side that's responding to move demand to hours of the day where we have an abundance of sun away from hours of the day where we have far less renewables generation. So that's time invariant pricing. And sort of thinking about how we can innovate around how your price varies over the time of day. The second thing I want to talk about is something maybe, how many people here pay their own electricity bill? Got a few. Have you been looking at your electricity bill? It's been going up. I mean, this is really remarkable. What this is showing you is since 2014, we're in PG&E service territory. Our electricity rates have gone up 127%. That is far faster than inflation. You look at that price, and to be clear, this is a price to you. So to distinguish this price from the price in my cartoon graph, the cartoon graph is a wholesale market. That's where we're buying and selling electricity, and your utility is buying electricity from that market. And then they're coming to you and selling you the electricity. So there's a difference between the wholesale price and the retail price. And it turns out there's a really big difference. Who sets that retail price? A regulator, a public utility commission. So basically how this works is your utility goes to the regulator and says, this is how much it's costing me to invest and generate and deliver electricity to my customers. Here's the amount of money I need to recover. And this is a simplification, but more or less the regulator looks at that big amount of money, divides it by the quantity of electricity your utility is going to sell, and that's the price you pay. So the reason your rates have been going up so much is not because the wholesale price is going up. That wholesale price has actually been going down a bit as we push in more renewables. It's wildfire mitigation. We're spending billions and billions of dollars every year to make our power system more resilient to increasing wildfire risk. It's transmission and distribution investments. If we're going to integrate renewables and we're going to improve the grid reliability, we need to make these investments. It's rooftop solar incentives and other incentives we want to put out there to incentivize various technologies. The point is that these costs are non-incremental. They don't vary with the amount of electricity you consume. They're just like a fixed cost being incurred in the power sector. And so what that does is the price that you're paying, a big part of that price is like a tax on electricity consumption to raise needed revenues for these various investments. So if economists could set these prices, and we can't, we've tried, but if we could, we would want to send you a price signal when you decide to do another load of laundry and consume another kilowatt hour that reflects the social marginal cost. So what the heck is that? That's jargon. It is, I consume another kilowatt hour. What's the value of the fuel, the air pollution, the climate damages, all those costs that I incur when I generate 1 kilowatt hour? What is that cost? And that's the signal we want to send you when you're deciding, do I want to turn my air conditioner up? I'm hot. I'm willing to pay something. We want to send you the actual cost. So we have done some work along with other colleagues to estimate the social marginal cost averaged across the year of electricity consumption in different parts of the country. There's a lot going on in this graph, and I know it's Friday afternoon, so let me walk you through it because I think it's interesting. So there's a few things I want. So these little triangles here, this is that wholesale price I talked about, right? This is the average cost to your utility of going to the wholesale electricity market and purchasing electricity on your behalf. The black triangles are your price. That's what you pay. And so you'll see I've circled in red, or put a red box around San Francisco. We're number one, and not in a good way, in terms of electricity retail prices being way above the wholesale price. What are these crazy blue lines? What we're doing here is, scientists and policymakers can't really agree on the social cost of carbon. There's a bunch of assumptions that go into that. And like the current administration has quite a different number than the past administration. But you can go from 0 to 200, and you can pick any of those, $0 per ton of carbon or 200. And it's still the case that the social cost of a kilowatt hour consumed in San Francisco is far below what you are paying. And the reason is we're taxing electricity to pay for all these non-incremental investments. And so The Economist is concerned about this, and I want to convince you that this is something this is a problem we should be trying to fix. So why worry about paying an electricity price that is way above the true cost? One, as I talked about at the beginning, we're trying to electrify. We're trying to convince houses and firms to electrify their cars and their transportation and their processes. And a heat pump, so what this is showing you here, we've done this all across the country, but in California, if a household heats their building, their home, with electricity versus natural gas, the social cost is a lot lower. You think about the emissions and all the fuel costs, et cetera. But from a private household perspective, the heat pump looks more expensive because they're paying a higher electricity price. So it's harder to convince households electricity that we're using to raise needed revenues. It turns out it's a really relatively regressive tax, meaning low-income homes spend a relatively large share of their income on their electricity bill. So if we were to raise these revenues using sales tax or investment taxes, we would be impacting lower-income households less than we are with this effective electricity tax. So for these reasons, we got pretty motivated to think about, this is some combination of market and regulatory failure. Prices are too high, and it's hurting our ability to electrify, and it's really undermining or intensifying affordability concerns around electricity rates. Ideally, we would move some of these costs, like wildfire mitigation costs. That's basically climate change adaptation. It's unclear why it should be on your electricity bill. So naively, as economists, we headed to Sacramento to try and find a less regressive tax base on which to put these utility bill costs, and we couldn't find one. It turns out it's very hard to raise income tax or sales tax in California. So what we proposed alternatively was the following, and again, we're economists, not marketers, so we called it the income graduated fixed charge, and we're taking alternative recommendations because that one didn't go over so well. But the issue is the following. If we were to reduce your electricity prices closer to social marginal cost, so what you see is the true cost of electricity consumption, we're sending the right signal, but we're billions of dollars short. Right? We all want to invest in wildfire risk mitigation. We all need transmission lines. If we instead recovered those costs in a flat fixed charge on your bill, back in 2019, that would have been $67 for everybody per month on your bill. So you'd pay a lower electricity rate and $67 fixed. That would also be quite regressive in terms of impacting low-income households. So instead, what we said is, we set the price equal to social marginal cost, and the fixed charge increases with income. This looks like a funky red staircase that's supposed to show you the fixed costs we would charge for people at different points in the income distribution. The way we built that staircase is how regressive or progressive, however you want to think about it, the sales tax is. So that would have a similar impact across the income distribution as the sales tax. Now, if you look at that, especially people in the back might not see that, that's over $150 per month for higher income folks. So this was a provocative proposal. But in the end, PUC commissioners, the governor is very concerned about high electricity rates and very concerned about shifting some of this cost base service charge. Your volumetric rate has been lowered, not to our social marginal costs, not even close, but we've got to walk before you run. And there are now more of the costs of running the power system being recovered in fixed charges that escalate with income. Is this a perfect solution? Probably not. Is it moving us in the right direction? I would say yes. Have we gotten hate mail about this? Absolutely. So I would love to hear from you, your concerns, because this is a work in progress. But I think it's the direction we need to be heading if we're going to be able to recover the cost of climate change mitigation and adaptation more equitably. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I have one more act that I will go quickly. So far, I've talked all about California, and it's really rewarding to work in your neighborhood with like people in your community to make changes that you personally can see. But if we're worried about climate change, we need to get out of California. And a lot of the electricity demand growth that's forecasted is forecasted to happen in emerging economies. So the last example of a project that I'd like to talk about that is in this theme of figure out market failures, figure out ways to solve them in this climate change mitigation adaptation space is India. I love visiting the country. I'm fascinated by it. And as many of you are probably aware, it's getting warmer everywhere in the world, but India is being particularly impacted. So you're seeing heat waves, which are not only just debilitating for people who don't have cooling to manage the heat, but there's also big concerns that as incomes rise and people adopt more and more fans, electricity demand is increasing, that increases greenhouse gas emissions, and it's also stressing out the grid. So on the hottest days, the grid is down because demand has exceeded the ability of the grid to keep running. So as an economist, I got interested in this and started working with researchers at IIT Mumbai, and became aware that so you often think about air conditioners. Ceiling fans are by far the most common appliance that Indian households use to stay cool as it gets hot. You can see high levels of penetration across low, middle, and high income. The other fact that's kind of discouraging is that less than 5%, barely 3% of these ceiling fans are energy efficient fans. I think back to like my old examples, like we have more efficient fan technology that was developed in the 1970s and 80s, brushless DC fans, but no one is adopting these fans. And so that means, we're seeing 40 million fans, more than that, bought every year, and we're locking in inefficient technology. So as the heat rises and incomes rise and people turn on their fans, we're using more than double the electricity that actually needs to be used relative to the more efficient fans. So the question is, what's going on? Why aren't people buying these fans? Is this a market failure? Is this a regulatory failure? So the first thing we did is it may be that these fans don't work well out there in the world, right? So we've been testing these fans at IIT Mumbai, but it seemed possible that when you install them in a home, we are working in Bihar and sort of lower income areas, voltage fluctuations, power outages might kill these fans. So you don't want to encourage households to buy somewhat more expensive fans if they're not going to function. So we worked with research at IIT Mumbai. We recruited a bunch of households. Some were our control households, and we just monitored their fan usage. And a subset of households allowed us to uninstall their conventional fan, put in this efficient fan, and just log usage for over a year. And what we found is that these fans work great. So what you can see here, this is the control fan power draw. The most efficient fan, these are the ones we're going to be focused on, exceeded engineering estimates. They use 67% less electricity. We tried to return the fans to people. They didn't want them. They really liked the new fans. They worked well. So this wasn't an issue of the technology doesn't work in this situation. So what's going on? So a household that's making this fan decision, these more efficient fans do cost a little bit more. And so if you're paying more, you want to see energy savings going forward. And here we have the reverse of California. Here, the social marginal cost of electricity in Bihar, where we're working, is about 30 rupees. Households pay a very subsidized rate because these are low-income households. There's a general consensus that electricity is an essential input to sort of health and productivity. So many households don't pay, and the households that do pay a 2 rupee rate. So if you're a household deciding whether to invest in a fan, you're not claiming the savings. And so you have very little, if any, incentive to invest in the more efficient fan. So briefly to talk about what's going on here, basically what we're doing here is when you're in the Best Buy and you're trying to figure out what air conditioner you want to buy, you're trading off upfront costs and the future costs of operating those fans. From a social perspective, if we value the energy savings, accounting for reduced air pollution, reduced climate impacts, these fans pay for themselves in months. But if you're a private household thinking about paying 2 rupees for your electricity, these fans don't make sense. It just doesn't pencil out. So we're going to see these fans, people will continue to buy millions of inefficient fans given this distortion. So one thing we're interested in is, well, if we subsidize these fans, will people buy them? They would write down their maximum willingness to pay for a fan. Then they'd use this scratch card. It's like a lottery card. They would scratch off a fan price. They knew that they would, there's a randomized subsidy. So they'd scratch off the price. If the price was lower than their bid, they would get it for that low price. If the price was higher than they bid, they couldn't bid the fan. And what this does is allow us to figure out the willingness to pay of households in these communities for fans. And we can build a demand curve. It doesn't look like my usual undergrad textbook. It's a little like wiggly. But basically what we found makes sense, right? At the current price, no one wants to buy the fan. When we bring the fan price close to the market, the other option in the market, the really inefficient fan in the market, many of these are used. All of a sudden you go from no one wants to buy it to 70, 80% of people want to buy these fans. So if we could subsidize the fans, and the subsidy we could rationalize based on external benefits, like how society benefits if we get that household to decide to buy a more efficient fan, we could save a lot of energy and emissions. The challenge here, my other examples, we lobbied, we talked to people in the industry, we talked to policymakers, and they decided to go for it. We have yet to find the stakeholder who wants to subsidize these fans. The utility doesn't want to subsidize these fans. They're already subsidizing electricity. The government does not have a whole lot of money lying around to subsidize fans. So we have documented a market regulatory failure. We have projected the increase in electricity if we continue to lock in inefficient versus efficient fans. We've yet to unlock the resources we would need to start to change those decisions in favor of more efficient fans. So to wrap up, I know that it's hard to get people excited about electricity prices. Most people want to think about pretty much anything else than the price they pay for electricity. I think these are really important, underappreciated tools that we have to use across the campus, is trying to help us think about where are these prices serving us, where are they sort of counter to where we want to go, and how can we fix it. I also want to just close with this slide. If there are any undergraduates in the room who there's a spark of interest in these types of problems and questions, in my biased opinion, there's no better campus to study energy and environmental economics. It's just an amazing community of undergraduates, graduates, postdocs, visitors, faculty, working closely with industry, regulators, public-private sectors to try and identify some of these problems, understand them better, and propose workable solutions. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions that you might have.
We have a question in the front. Yeah, wait for the mic though. It's coming.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much. Okay, so I came from Indonesia.
Okay.
A fourth most populous country
Mhm.
in the world with 280 million people. But also at the same time, we are 66% of all electricity comes from coal.
Mm-hmm.
But our challenge is basically, first, we are island countries,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the big grid system is not the way for us.
Yep.
And just to give a context for everyone is that our GDP per capita is like $12,000 purchasing power parity,
Mm-hmm.
while the US is 75,000.
Yep.
And our electricity per capita is like 1,200, while the US is 12,000. The way. The second is that our market is inefficient, meaning that the state-owned and monopolized the electricity system, right? So we cannot have this,
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing is that the cost of retiring coal plant is super expensive. So retire one coal plant is like $1.2 billion, maybe. So my question is, actually, this is important, is that I'm currently working on a capstone project for Chief of Economics, where I studied a low-income household, like the characteristic and so on, from 55 million households, where the total households is 70 million. So most of so and the sensitivity of prices in this household is it's just my but so my question is that should I give up in this idea? Really, that's just
Yeah, and I just so no, don't give up is my answer, even with it before really understanding the question, because you seem motivated and interested and passionate. I guess I don't understand the question. The question is specifically
how do we yeah
towards a more sustainable decarbonized system. Yes.
where should I start?
Yeah.
The political ways.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I guess, and I would be happy to talk longer with you because it seems like you're really interested, and I frankly do not know much about Indonesia. But I guess one answer, there's no silver bullet. Every country is different, and fortunately we do have a lot of options, but there are some countries where it's going to be really hard to decarbonize, both because of their natural resources. They don't have expansive wind, they don't have expansive solar, and very real development decisions. You'll notice I didn't suggest that we should increase electricity prices in India to send the right price signal. That's not the right answer for an economy that's still developing. So I guess the only thing I will say that is hopeful is I do think that, you know, here in California, we're doing a lot to reduce our own emissions. I think the most important thing we can do is R&D to reduce the cost of renewables and clean solutions. So then it becomes the more economic option for some of these countries who are balancing, you know, striking a really difficult balance between real economic development considerations. But I would love to talk to you more because I think there are a number of island countries where rooftop solar, batteries, like there are systems, but there are also entrenched sort of political institutional constraints that make the solutions that look great in a spreadsheet much harder to translate on the ground. But would be happy to talk to you more. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think part of the benefit that was from like solar and storage, especially in distributed generation, is like modularity, you know, production close to consumption. And you mentioned as big problems with the increase in rates, like wildfire protection and transmission lines. How do you see the role of maybe more decentralized energy like BPP, demand response, and why are they catching on? Is it a problem with like rate-based system and the incentives for the utility?
Yeah, it's a big question. Let me take it in parts. So I mean, I think yeah, so wildfire, $5, $6, $7 billion a year to make our grid more resilient. I think the question about microgrids and decentralized systems, there is some work there. However, you know, I think one of the things I didn't mention is there are like regulatory compacts that sort of define the utility's role and obligation to serve customers. And one of them is an obligation to serve reliable power. That requirement is getting more and more expensive, but it does mean when you go to a community and say, yeah, you're high wildfire risk, like forget this grid, here's a microgrid. That can be a pretty hard sell. And in fact, legally, the community has to accept that as a perfect substitute. So I think there is definitely work to complement the grid with some of these decentralized systems so that at least you can turn the grid off for longer periods of time in real like red flag days rather than invest all the money and so I think they're complements, but probably not yet substitutes, at least from the perspective of the communities that are being asked to accept this in lieu of the grid. Demand response, I think economists get really excited about like real-time price every hour of the day, your price difference from my price because we're in like different distribution system areas. The appetite of your typical California household for that is limited. I see more promise in smart appliances. And there's experimentation with that. Like, don't ask me to pay, like use my cognitive resources to figure out when I'm gonna heat my water for my shower. But if there's an easy setting, and better yet, if it's defaulted in when I buy it, I think that's more promising. So I think it's this combination of behavior and willingness to accept with like the technical potential that we're still trying to navigate. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Just a quick question about what impact is AI going to have on what you're trying to do? And is that spread by state or is it spread across the country in terms of the costs that are going to come to bear?
Great question, and the answer is changing by the day. So data centers are projected to, like, we know directionally what they're going to do. They're going to increase demand, and that does make the challenge a little bit more daunting because we're already trying to build to replace the fossil with green and keep up with electrification. And now all of a sudden, the new kid in town is huge. It's really hard to get a sense of how huge, both because, you know, who knows how far AI will go. And also, these companies really need to find electricity. So the same data projects are being proposed all over the place, and we're not sure if we're triple, quadruple counting, just like how much we're talking about. But we do know that the load is going to, the demand is going to go up from data centers. I think I heard a second part of the question, which is a really important question, and the answer really is changing. In those first few contracts, getting back to this obligation to serve. Utilities have traditionally had an obligation to serve. So if you want to open a yoga studio or a coffee shop, or you want to move in, like, they need to serve you. And early days, the data centers had the same sort of like, we want to build here, you got to build for us. I think we're rethinking that. And so the data centers we're seeing now, the contracts are proprietary, but my understanding from talking to different people is data centers are so hungry for power. Utilities and communities have bargaining power. And so now what we're starting to see is innovative contracts that are saying, okay, you know, you got to pay for all the grid upgrades up front. We're not going to ask the community to pay. So we're seeing real changes. There's some learning by doing, and, you know, we're going to learn the hard way some ways. But I do think, to quickly answer your question, demand's going to go up. It is going to be more challenging to keep on our path of decarbonizing electricity and keeping up with electrification with that innovation. But I also see reason for hope and optimism as we figure out how to integrate these big loads into the grid and maybe reduce electricity rates, right? So why are our rates so high? We're putting those wildfire investments, spreading them over our kilowatt hours. If a data center increases the number of kilowatt hours, it is possible, even likely with some careful contract negotiation, to spread those costs over some of that load from data centers. So it's easy to vilify in data centers. You also have the other side where they're going to solve all our problems. I'm somewhere in the middle, but I think we need to be paying attention and thinking really carefully about how our traditional ways of doing business should be modified to accommodate a very non-traditional load. Yeah.
Hi, earlier you spoke about how energy prices are actually in the negative at some point.
Yes, yeah.
Explain a little more about what that means and why that is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of reasons, but one reason is renewable generators earn tax credits per megawatt hour. They earn incentives per megawatt hour. So imagine, you know, that you have a policy incentive that's $20 per megawatt hour. You're willing to pay $10 to get $20. So part of that is a big part of it, is that there's a real incentive to try and get these resources producing. And so that means, and we've built a lot of them, and they're all producing at the same time because the sun rises and sets at the same time all over California. So yeah, now I should mention that's happening for the wonks in the room. This is duck season. There's a famous duck graph. Some are nodding, and this is like such an obscure fact, but basically in the times of year like this, when we got a lot of sun, but not a lot of heat, we got a lot of solar power being put on the system, but we haven't turned on our air conditioners yet. So we got too much sun in the middle of the day. Come back in August, there are no negative prices. You know, air conditioners are cranking. So one of the features of these types of systems, when we got a lot of renewables and not a whole lot of batteries to soak up that sun, is you are going to see these, you know, sort of counterintuitive negative prices at some periods of the year. So we have enough solar at periods of the year where demand really peaks, and we're going to need that sun to keep our air conditioners running. So hopefully that answers your question.
Last question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Amazing lecture. I have a question about renewables and their costs. So renewables are by far the cheapest option we have currently on the energy market, especially solar. But on the other hand, we also need additional infrastructure for renewables, such as pump storage and battery storage, that will lead to a price increase. If you may have to put that into like a percentage, how much more expensive will renewables get through the additional infrastructure that we need? And will they, if we implement that, which we will need to do if we want to have a 100% green energy market, will the economics of renewables still be feasible?
It's a big question. I think the analysis I've seen, and that's more of like, is it depends where we build them and how we build them, right? So I think the early planning models, we were putting the wind in the best place we could put them, like in the windy place where no one lives. But then we got to build transmission over many states and jurisdictions, and that got really expensive. So I'm not going to be able, I'll frankly answer your question. You're making a good point that the costs we see, the levelized cost of energy, include like the steel in the ground and the labor and the operating costs, but not the rebuilding of the system to absorb a different type of resource. But I think that what we're seeing is there's still, even those costs notwithstanding, they still are the most, in many parts of the country, the most cost-effective way to go. The challenge is our system wasn't built to, like institutions, governance, law was not built to accommodate them quite yet. So it's a very slow rollout. But I remain optimistic on the costs continuing to go down, and we're learning to use demand response, batteries, storage, Western grid integration more effectively, that they will remain the most cost competitive. Whether the policy environment will support the level of expansion that we're needing to see is an open question.
Wonderful. Thank you. Everyone, please join me in the last round of applause for Miss Emeritus Fowlie.
Thank you.